Teena Robbins was sitting on the floor of her bridal suite, not a chair, not the velvet chaise by the window, but the cold marble floor in a $12,000 wedding dress. With mascara tracks cutting down her cheeks and a phone pressed so hard against her chest, she could feel her own heartbeat fighting it. The clock on the wall read 11:30 a.m. 30 minutes. She had 30 minutes before she walked down that aisle and handed her life over to a man she now knew with a certainty that made her physically sick was a monster. There was no one she could call. Her mother thought Julian was a gift from God. Her best friend was already seated in the front row. Her entire world had been quietly, methodically rearranged over 3 years until the only person who stood between Teena Robbins and complete isolation was Julian himself. No one except one name. A number she had deleted from her phone, but never, not once in 5 years, deleted from her memory. Her fingers were trembling so badly she mistyped it twice. Then she hit send. "I can't marry him. It's always been you. Please." She didn't know if he would answer. She didn't know if he still cared. She didn't know if 5 years of silence and a goodbye she'd never fully explained had destroyed every last bridge between them. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that across the city, in the back seat of a black SUV with tinted windows dark enough to swallow daylight, Hon Ji had been watching that number for 5 years. Not obsessively, not desperately. The way a man who has accepted a wound watches the sky quietly, without expectation, because some things you simply do not stop feeling. His phone buzzed. He read the message once. He didn't read it again. He stepped out of the SUV onto the sunlit street black suit, collar open, the dark ink of his tattoos trailing up his neck like a language. Only danger understood, and the 2 bodyguards flanking him went instantly, instinctively still, because they knew that posture. They had seen what followed it. He looked up. His jaw tightened by exactly 1 degree. Then, in a voice so calm it was its own kind of violence, he said 3 words to the man on his left. "Get the cars ready." That was all. No raised voice. No dramatic declaration. Just 3 words, and within 60 seconds, the most feared syndicate operation in the city pivoted on a single axis, her name, and became something else entirely. Something unstoppable. Something coming. Now. To understand what happened inside that wedding venue at 12:01 p.m., the standoff, the shattered empire, the oak doors blown open, the moment an entire room full of powerful people went absolutely silent, you have to understand what happened 5 years ago. Between a girl who believed safety was something you could choose, and a man who loved her enough to let her walk away. You have to understand the night everything broke, and then you have to understand the truth about who broke it. Because Julian Mercer didn't just find Teena Robbins. He manufactured the moment she became available. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story is traveling. The dress weighed more than she expected. That was the first thing Teena had thought when her maid of honor zipped her into it that morning, how heavy it was, how the structured boning of the bodice pressed against her ribs like a hand that wouldn't let go. She'd laughed it off then, made some joke about Julian sparing no expense. Everyone in the room had smiled the way people smile when they are happy for you, when they believe the life you are stepping into is the one you deserve. That was 4 hours ago. Now she was alone on the marble floor, and the dress felt like a verdict. The bridal suite at Hargrove Estate was the kind of room that existed to make women feel chosen. Ivory drapes pooling at the floor, a vanity rimmed in warm gold light. White roses, 2 dozen, maybe 3, arranged so perfectly they looked artificial. Julian had ordered them himself. Julian had ordered everything himself, right down to the shade of her lipstick, a soft, camera-ready coral that his publicist had recommended because it photographed warmly on darker skin tones. He'd presented that note with a smile, the kind of smile that expected gratitude. She had thanked him. That was the thing about Julian Mercer that had taken her so long to see clearly. He never raised his voice. He never made threats she could point to, hold up, show someone else and say, "Here, do you see it?" He simply arranged the world around her until the shape of her own life no longer fit who she actually was. until every room she walked into had already been decorated by his preferences. Every conversation she had was with people he had approved of first. Every morning she woke up was inside a reality he had quietly, methodically constructed for her. 3 years. It had taken her 3 years to understand that what she was living in wasn't a relationship. It was an installation. And she had nearly made it permanent. She pressed the back of her head against the wall and closed her eyes. And the morning replayed itself the way bad things always do, not in order, not cleanly, but in flashes. The pieces her brain kept snagging on like fabric on a splinter. She had gone to his private office to find the vow card. That was all. His personal vows, which he'd told her were handwritten, locked in the top drawer of his desk because he wanted them to be a surprise. She'd wanted to move them to his jacket pocket before the ceremony. A small, wifely thing, a gesture of care. She'd known where the spare key was because Julian, for all his meticulous control, kept one consistent habit: he hid things in obvious places, because he never truly believed anyone around him was paying attention. He was almost right about that. The vow card wasn't in the drawer. What she found instead was a file. Not digital. Physical. Printed. Paper-clipped. The kind of documentation a man keeps when he wants a record he controls entirely. And her name was on the tab. Robbins, T, Asset Profile, Acquisition Timeline. She hadn't understood it at first. She'd stood there in her silk robe, her hair half-pinned, reading words that refused to arrange themselves into sense. Words like leverage and demographic alignment. And Phase 1, isolation from prior network. A timeline that began not when she thought she'd met Julian at that gallery opening, that apparently coincidental meeting, but 14 months earlier. Research, photographs, notes on her routines, her vulnerabilities, what one clinical line described as her primary psychological trigger: fear of violence and criminal exposure, reinforced by 2019 incident. The 2019 incident. Her hands had started shaking before she finished the page. Because in 2019, Teena Robbins had been walking home from Hyeon's apartment on a Tuesday night when 3 men had come out of an alleyway and surrounded her. They hadn't robbed her. They hadn't touched her. They had simply stood there, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke and metal, and one of them had said quietly, conversationally, like he was telling her the weather, that the man she was sleeping with had dangerous enemies, and that she should think very carefully about whether she was willing to pay for his mistakes. She had never told Hyeon exactly what they said. She had told him she was scared, that his world was too much, that she loved him but she couldn't live like that, always looking over her shoulder, always knowing that who he was could get her killed. She had broken up with him 3 days later. What the file told her, what made her sink slowly to her knees on the hardwood floor of Julian's private office, was that those 3 men had not been Hyeon's enemies. They had been Julian's employees. He had manufactured her fear, staged the threat, engineered the moment that shattered the one relationship standing between her and his access to her. And then he had waited, patient and deliberate as a man who understood that trauma, properly applied, reshapes a person's entire architecture of trust. By the time she'd gathered herself enough to walk back to the bridal suite, her face carefully arranged, nodding at the coordinator in the hallway, accepting a glass of champagne, she immediately sat down. By then she understood that she was not a bride. She was an acquisition at the finish line. And Julian Mercer, who would stand at the altar in 40 minutes in his bespoke charcoal suit with his campaign-ready smile, intended to close the deal. The phone was still warm in her hands. She stared at the sent message and felt the specific terror of a person who has thrown something fragile into the dark and cannot know whether the ground below is close or impossibly far. "I can't marry him. It's always been you, please." 5 years. She had not said his name out loud in 5 years. Not because she'd forgotten it, or because it had faded the way some things fade, but because saying it did something to the inside of her chest that she'd decided, at 26, she could not afford. Hon Ji was not the kind of man you got over. He was the kind of man you made a decision about. And the decision Teena had made was to choose a life that felt survivable over a love that felt like standing at the edge of something enormous with no railing and no map. She had been so certain that was the right call. She pressed her fingers over her mouth and let herself remember him. Really remember him. Not the sanitized version she'd constructed to make the leaving bearable. Not he was dangerous. It couldn't have worked. The real one. The actual man. She remembered the way he took up space in a room, not loudly, but completely. The way a storm takes up the sky. The dark ink of his tattoos and how she'd learned them the way you learn a language, tracing the patterns along his collarbone in the early mornings, when the light in his apartment was gray and soft, and nothing about the world felt like a threat. She remembered that he laughed rarely enough that when he did, it felt like being trusted with something. She remembered that he had never, in 2 years, raised his voice at her, had never made her feel small, had looked at her specifically her, not the version of her he needed her to be, with an attention so total it used to make her breath catch. She remembered the night she ended it, how he'd stood completely still while she said her carefully prepared words, his dark eyes steady on her face, and when she finished, he had said only, "Is that what you really want? Not a manipulation. Not a guilt trip." A genuine question, offered with open hands, and she had said yes because she was 26 and terrified, and the men in the alleyway had made her believe that loving him was a death sentence. He had let her go. That still broke something in her, 5 years later, that he had loved her enough to let her walk away from him rather than fight for something that was making her afraid. She did not know what he was now. She knew the rumors. Everyone in certain circles knew the rumors about Hon Ji, what he'd built, how far his reach extended, the particular silence that fell in rooms when his name came up. She had deliberately not looked, not Googled, not listened when the whispers drifted close. Because if she knew exactly how deep that world went, she wasn't sure she could keep her decision intact. Now she was sitting on a marble floor in a wedding dress, and the decision had dissolved on its own. Across the city, 43 blocks and an entire world away, the message landed. Hon Ji read it, standing in the open door of his SUV, one hand on the roof, the sun cutting hard across his face. His security lead, Park, was mid-sentence about the afternoon schedule a meeting at the port, 2 calls with associates in Seoul, and stopped speaking the moment he registered what was happening to his employer's face. Not an explosion. Hyeon Ji did not explode. What Park saw instead was the opposite. A stillness so complete it was almost physical, like watching a frequency change the same face, the same body, but suddenly inhabited by something different, something that had been very carefully held in reserve for a very long time. Hyeon lowered his phone, his yaw set, and then he turned to Park with the particular calm that the people who worked for him had learned, over years, to treat as the most serious signal in their entire operational vocabulary, calmer than anger, more absolute than any raised voice, and said, "Call Chen. Full motorcade. I want 6 cars at Hargrove Estate in 25 minutes. A pause, so brief it was almost nothing. And pull everything we have on Julian Mercer's security contract. I want names, positions, weapon loadouts. We have 30 minutes. Park did not ask questions. That was the other thing about working for Hyeon Ji. You learned very quickly that when he looked like that particular locked-in stillness, that voice like the moment before a verdict questions, were not what the situation required. Within 90 seconds, 3 phones were ringing simultaneously in 3 different locations across the city. Within 3 minutes, 6 black vehicles had been rerouted from their existing assignments and were converging on a single pickup point. Within 5 minutes, Park had a complete diagram of Hargrove Estate's private security deployment on his tablet guard rotations, entry points, communications frequencies sourced from a contact inside the firm Julian had hired, a contact who had been on Hyun's quiet payroll for 14 months. Because Hyeon Ji had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence is the kind you build before you need it. He got into the SUV. The door closed. He looked at the message one more time. "It's always been you." His thumb hovered over the reply field for 3 seconds. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket because there was nothing to say yet that the next 30 minutes wouldn't say better. "Drive," he said, and the motorcade moved. The knock at the bridal suite door came at 11:38. Teena heard it, and her whole body locked. She was on her feet before the second knock landed, moving to the vanity, pressing the phone flat against her thigh, catching her reflection in the gold-rimmed mirror, and working fast, deliberate to rearrange her face into something that looked like a nervous bride, and not a woman who was executing a covert operation in her wedding dress. She blotted the mascara damage as best she could, straightened the off-shoulder neckline of her gown, took one breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Come in." Julian opened the door the way he did everything, with a ease that was also, somehow, a demonstration of ownership. He was already in his suit, charcoal and immaculate, his salt and pepper hair arranged with the kind of precision that required a professional. He was objectively handsome. She had thought so the night she met him. She had thought so for 2.5 years, right up until this morning, when handsomeness had become completely irrelevant information. He looked at her the way he always looked at her in front of people, admiringly, warmly, the performance of a man who loved his fiancée, and for the first time, she could see the scaffolding underneath it, the calculation in the warmth, the performance in the admiration. "You disappeared on me," he said, stepping into the room. His eyes moved over her in a quick, efficient sweep that she now recognized for what it was, an inventory check. "Coordinator said you've been in here for a while. Everything all right?" "Just nervous." The words came out smoother than she expected. Some survival instinct she hadn't known she possessed had apparently decided this was its moment. "I'm fine. It's just, 30 minutes. He smiled. 17, actually. She held his gaze. "Right. Of course." He crossed to her, and it took everything she had not to step back. He lifted her hand, the one without the phone, and brought it to his lips, his eyes on hers the entire time. The gesture was tender, and it meant absolutely nothing, and she understood now that it had never meant anything, that every soft thing Julian Mercer had ever done for her had been a line item in a strategy document. "You look extraordinary," he said. "Thank you," she said. Her phone was pressed flat against her outer thigh, hidden in the gathered fabric of her skirt. She could feel it like a pulse. She had turned the screen brightness all the way down and the sound completely off before she'd answered the door. And now she stood very still and very straight, and smiled the way she'd watched women smile in photographs from campaign events, warmly, effortlessly, revealing nothing. Julian studied her face for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You've been crying," he said. "Happy tears." She tilted her head slightly, let her eyes soften. "I keep thinking about my mom in the front row. You know how I get." Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of assessment, there and gone. Then the campaign smile returned, practiced and seamless. 15 minutes, he said. "Don't keep me waiting." He kissed her cheek. His cologne was expensive, and she would never be able to smell it again without wanting to disappear. He left the way he came, easy, certain, the walk of a man who had never once genuinely doubted that he would get exactly what he wanted. The door clicked shut. Teena counted to 5. Then she pulled the phone out from the folds of her skirt with a shaking hand. No reply from Hyeon. But the message showed delivered, and below it, a single notification that made her close her eyes for 1 full second in something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. A text, sent while she'd been managing Julian in the doorway. 3 words, 3 words. "Don't move. Coming." The Hargrove estate sat behind a private gate on the eastern edge of the city, the kind of address that communicated generational wealth without needing to announce it. The grounds were immaculate rolling lawns, a hedge-lined drive, a stone manor that had been photographed in architectural magazines. Julian had chosen it specifically because it photographed well. Everything Julian chose was because it photographed well. The estate's private security detail, 14 men, contracted through a firm that Julian maintained on a semi-permanent retainer, were stationed according to a deployment plan that had been filed, updated, and considered confidential. Chen had the full diagram on his tablet before the motorcade cleared the first intersection. 6 vehicles moved in coordinated formation through the city, unhurried, clean, nothing that would trip a traffic camera or draw a second look from anyone watching. To any observer, they were simply black cars. To anyone who knew what to look for, they were a very specific kind of precision, moving at a very specific speed toward a very specific purpose. In the lead vehicle, Hyeon sat forward slightly in his seat, elbows on his knees, watching the estate entrance materialize on the tablet screen that Chen held angled toward him. His expression had not shifted in the 22 minutes since they'd left. The cold focus that had settled over his face when he'd read Teena's message was still there, absolute and unhurried, like a man who has made his decision and released everything that isn't relevant to executing it. Outer perimeter, Chen said quietly, zooming in. 4 on the gate, 2 on the east garden. Rotation cycle is 12 minutes. They're currently 8 minutes into rotation. Hyeon studied the positions. Communications frequency? Jammed starting at the 4-minute mark before approach. Their internal comms will read as signal interference. Standard estate equipment malfunction. Chen turned the tablet. East garden is the cleanest entry. Their cameras have a 40-second blind window when the south unit passes the fountain. Hyeon nodded once. Min and Cha take the gate, he said. Ryu takes the south wall with his unit. The remaining 2 cars hold at the perimeter road as extraction. Not loudly. The way you speak when you know you will not be asked to repeat yourself. Not loudly. The way you speak when you know you will not be asked to repeat yourself. Quietly. No shots unless it's unavoidable. I need the inside intact until I'm through the doors. He paused. What's her location? Bridal suite. 2nd floor, northeast corner. Window faces the garden. He sat back. For exactly 3 seconds, something moved across his face that was not tactical and not cold. Something older. Something that had been living quietly in the back of his chest for 5 years without complaint. He let it exist for those 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and the focus was back, and the estate walls were visible now through the tinted windshield, and the vehicles were slowing without being told to, because everyone in this motorcade had worked with Hon Ji long enough to understand that when you were this close to what he came for, you moved like water, inevitable and silent, and already inside the walls before anyone registered the flood. The first car peeled off toward the service road. The second followed 20 seconds later. By the time the estate's outer security team registered that anything was unusual, a flicker of static on their comms, a guard in the east garden who simply stopped responding, another at the north gate, who had been walked firmly, professionally, and wordlessly, to a position behind the stone wall, where he would remain temporarily indisposed. The perimeter was already changed. Hyeon stepped out of the SUV at the east garden entrance. The afternoon light was sharp and clean, and somewhere inside that building, in a 2nd-floor room with a northeast window, a woman in a wedding dress was counting minutes. He straightened his jacket. The tattoos on his neck, his hand, the edges of ink visible at his collar, none of it hidden, none of it softened. He came as exactly what he was. He looked at the manor's main entrance, the stone steps, the oak double doors, the wedding guests already assembled beyond them, the ceremony already beginning to move toward its scripted conclusion, and he walked forward. Not fast, not dramatically, just with the absolute, unmistakable certainty of a man who has already decided how this ends. The wedding coordinator knocked at 11:45 with the particular brightness of someone who had no idea what kind of room she was walking into. It's time, Miss Robbins. Teena looked at herself in the vanity mirror one last time. The mascara had been repaired. The lipstick, Julian's chosen coral, was perfect. Her hair was still pinned elegantly, pearl drops catching the light at her ears, the diamond on her left hand throwing small prisms across the ivory wall. She looked from the outside, exactly like a woman about to begin the best day of her life. The seamstress had sewn a hidden pocket into the gathered skirt almost apologetically, calling it a practical afterthought for a modern bride. She slid the phone into it now, the screen dim, the 3 words still glowing. 3 words on the screen. Don't move. Coming. No further messages. No update. No confirmation that he was close, or that the 30 minutes hadn't run out while she was managing Julian's eyes in the doorway. She had no way of knowing where Hyeon was. She had no way of knowing if he would make it. She had nothing except those 3 words and the decision she had made on a marble floor, and she was going to have to walk down that aisle on the strength of both. She took the coordinator's arm. The hallway outside the bridal suite was lined with fresh flowers, white roses, again, arranged in tall vases at every turn, and the sound of the string quartet drifted up from below, warm and ceremonial and completely oblivious. 2 of Julian's private security men were positioned at the top of the staircase. They had been there all morning. She had been introduced to them on the first day of venue setup, as if their presence were a courtesy, a protective measure, something a man of Julian's profile simply required. She understood now that they were not there to protect her. She smiled at them as she passed. They did not smile back. They watched her with the flat professional attention of men whose job was not to make her comfortable, but to make sure she arrived at the correct destination. She descended the staircase. The lobby of Hargrove Manor opened into a wide, columned corridor that led directly to the ceremony hall, and as Teena moved through it, she caught glimpses through the tall windows of the estate grounds, the manicured lawn, the hedgerows, the afternoon sun burning clean and indifferent over all of it. She looked without being obvious about it, looking for black cars, looking for any sign of movement at the tree line or the garden wall. Nothing she could see. Nothing she could confirm. Her heart was doing something complicated behind her sternum. At the entrance to the ceremony hall, her uncle, her mother's brother, the man Julian had approved as her escort because he was a judge and it photographed well, was waiting. At the entrance to the ceremony hall, her Uncle Richard was waiting her mother's brother, a judge, the man Julian had selected as her escort not for sentiment, but because he photographed well beside a politician. He had the particular proud, emotional expression of a man who believed entirely in what he was participating in. He took her arm and squeezed it, and she squeezed back, and the squeeze she gave him was the most honest thing she had done all morning, because it came from a real place, the part of her that understood he was innocent in all of this, that everyone standing on the other side of those doors was innocent in all of this, that the deception she was living inside had been architected by one man, and she was the only person in the building who knew it. The doors opened. The quartet shifted into the processional, and 300 heads turned, and the hall, which was long and high-ceilinged and filled with afternoon light and the specific, breathless attention of a crowd watching something they believed to be beautiful, opened up before her like a throat. Julian was at the altar. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her in public, with visible, performed devotion, his hand clasped in front of him. His posture, the posture of a man deeply moved. The officiant stood to his left. The wedding party was arranged in soft symmetry on either side. The flowers were extraordinary. The light was extraordinary. Everything about the composition of the scene was exactly what a person would want, documented, preserved, displayed. Teena walked. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, not on Julian, not on the doors at the back of the hall, because she could not look at the doors without the desperation showing on her face, and she had come too far in the last 30 minutes to let desperation show on her face now. She walked at the correct pace, which was the pace Julian had insisted they rehearse twice, a slow and dignified progression that would look best on camera. Her uncle's arm was solid under her hand. She focused on that, on the physical reality of it, the warmth, the steadiness. She breathed through her nose and counted steps, and kept her face in the composition of a woman arriving at something she has chosen. She passed row 4 and felt her mother's eyes on her, wet and proud, and the guilt of it was almost physical. Her mother had no idea. Her mother was sitting there believing this was the beginning of her daughter's great happiness, and Teena could not look at her directly, because if she did, she would either come apart or change course, and neither option was available to her right now. She passed row 8. She passed row 12. The altar was close now. Julian's eyes were on her, and she met them, and she saw, because she was looking for it now, she knew how to look the flicker of satisfaction beneath the warmth, the acquisition complete behind the devotion. He extended his hand to receive her, and her uncle placed her hand into his, and Julian's grip was exactly firm enough to remind her that he had never, in 3 years, offered her anything she could simply put down when she wanted to. The officiant began. She heard the words, "Dearly beloved," gathered here today from somewhere that felt slightly removed from her body, the way you hear sound when the blood is very loud in your ears. She was present, and she was not present. She was standing at an altar in a wedding dress, and she was also, simultaneously, in some other dimension of herself that was simply waiting, holding a breath it had been holding for 22 minutes. Julian's thumb moved over her knuckles. A small motion. Private. Proprietorial. 11 seconds. That was how long she stood there at the altar, while the officiant spoke, and the crowd watched, and Julian held her hand 11 seconds that felt like the interior of something much longer, much heavier. And then the oak doors at the back of the hall came open. Not slowly. Not ceremonially. They came open the way something comes open when the people on the other side have decided that the doors are a formality and formalities are finished. The sound hit the room before the sight did a deep, structural boom that bounced off the high ceiling and dropped into the proceedings like a stone into still water, and the ripple was immediate and total. Heads turned. Someone in the back rows startled visibly. The quartet stopped mid-phrase, a broken note hanging in the air and then gone. Julian's grip on Teena's hand tightened. She didn't look at him. She looked at the doors. Hon Ji walked through them. He walked the way he'd driven across the city, not fast, not dramatically, but with a momentum that was its own kind of force. The kind that doesn't require speed because it has already calculated everything between here and the destination and found none of it particularly obstructing. His black suit caught the afternoon light from the clear-story windows. The tattoos at his neck and collar were visible, the ink at his right hand dark against his skin as it hung at his side, loose and ready. His face was the face Teena remembered from those early mornings in his apartment when something had threatened what he cared about, not hot, not explosive, but locked in with a clarity so total it was almost cold. 4 men came in behind him and fanned without instruction into positions along the side walls of the hall. They did not draw anything. They did not need to. Their presence communicated the full message without assistance. The hall had gone completely, absolutely silent. Hyeon walked down the aisle. He walked it the way he walked into every room, like he had always been supposed to be there, and the rest of the room was only now catching up to that fact. His eyes went past 300 people as if they were furniture, past the wedding party, past the flowers and the light and the entire elaborate production Julian Mercer had constructed, and they found Teena. And they stayed. She felt it land on her like something physical, that attention, that specific and total focus, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 5 years, and then for 30 minutes, and then for 11 interminable seconds at an altar, made a sound like a lock disengaging. Julian released her hand, not willingly. The way a man releases something when he is calculating whether holding on serves him better than letting go, and the calculation comes back unclear. He turned from the altar to face the aisle, and his campaign composure was still intact, barely, visibly effortful, but intact, and when he spoke, his voice carried the practiced authority of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. "I don't know who you are," Julian said, "but I will give you exactly 1 opportunity to turn around." Hyeon did not stop walking. "Remove him," Julian said to his security. 3 of Julian's men moved from their positions along the walls, the inner detail, the ones who'd been inside the hall all along, stationed as discreet fixtures of the ceremony. They moved toward the aisle with the professional efficiency of men who had done this kind of thing before. They made it approximately 4 steps. Hyeon's 4 men moved at the same moment, with a coordination so clean it was almost choreographic, and the resulting stillness, the new, recalibrated stillness, in which Julian's security found themselves in positions that made further movement inadvisable, settled over the hall like a drop in temperature. Hyeon stopped 6 feet from the altar. He looked at Julian Mercer for the first time, and the look was brief and complete, and communicated, without any ambiguity at all, exactly what Hyeon thought of everything Julian had constructed in this room. Then he looked at Teena. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice, directed at her, was different. Not soft, exactly, but without the cold edge, the way a frequency changes when it finds what it has been looking for. She shook her head. He gave one small nod, like something confirmed. Then he turned back to Julian, and the cold edge returned, and it brought company. Everybody put them down. Julian's voice had shifted. The campaign warmth was gone now, stripped by the particular pressure of a situation that no longer responded to performance. What was underneath it was harder, and older, and uglier, and she recognized it as the real thing, the register she had caught only twice in 3 years, in unguarded moments, and had filed away in a part of herself that she hadn't known how to name yet. He had produced a small gesture with his right hand, a signal, minimal and precise, and 3 more men materialized from a side door behind the altar. These ones were not the contracted estate security. These were something else. Something Julian had brought in privately, a layer below the visible layer, the kind of arrangement a man makes when he understands that the visible layer can fail. 7 guns, various positions. The hall had the particular taut, held-breath quality of a room in which everyone present has simultaneously understood that the category of event they are attending has fundamentally changed. The wedding guests, senators, lobbyists, old money donors, television personalities, a sitting state governor in the 7th row sat in a stillness so complete it was almost reverent. Hyeon had not moved. His hands were at his sides. He had not flinched at the weapons the way a person flinches when a weapon surprises them. He had registered them the way you register information you already accounted for. Julian stepped away from the altar. He moved toward Teena, and the angle of his movement was calculated, putting her between himself and Hyeon, which was not a protective gesture, and they all understood it was not a protective gesture. "I don't know what she told you," Julian said to Hyeon, his voice restored to something approaching smoothness. "But whatever you think you're doing, you need to understand the position you're in. This is a private estate. These are licensed security professionals. You are trespassing at a private ceremony. I have 1 phone call to make and you are done." Hyeon looked at him. When he spoke, it was not loud. The hall was so silent that it didn't need to be. "Make the call," Hyeon said. "Your communications have been down for the last 14 minutes, but try." Something moved across Julian's face, a fracture, very small in the smoothness. "I want to tell you something," Hyeon continued, and his voice had not changed register, had not risen, had not performed anything, it simply delivered, with the flat certainty of a man reading a documented fact, in front of everyone in this room, because some things should not be private. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. He turned it and held it up, not to Julian, but angled toward the room. On the screen was a photograph of a document, a printed page with a paperclip and a tab. The image was clear enough that people in the first several rows could make out, if they leaned slightly, the header text. Robbins T. Asset Profile. Acquisition Timeline. "This file," Hyeon said, "was in Julian Mercer's private office this morning. His legal team compiled it starting 4 years ago. It documents a coordinated campaign to isolate and acquire a specific individual for the purpose of political asset management." He lowered the phone. "It also documents the funding and coordination of a staged threatening incident in 2019, executed by 3 contracted operatives, designed to destabilize that individual's prior relationship and create the psychological conditions for his access to her." The silence in the hall had become a different kind of silence. Not the held-breath silence of people watching a confrontation, the heavier, slower silence of people absorbing something that is rearranging what they thought they were sitting in the middle of. Julian laughed. It was a short, professional sound, the laugh of a man reframing a narrative in real time. "This is extraordinary," he said to the room, pivoting slightly, working the audience the way he worked audiences. "I don't know what—" "There were also offshore accounts," Hyeon said, as if Julian hadn't spoken. 7 of them, across 4 jurisdictions. The kind of accounts a man keeps when he needs to move money that cannot be officially accounted for. Campaign contributions that weren't reported. Payments to the men who were at the perimeter of this estate this morning before my team arrived." He paused. "Those accounts have been frozen." The documentation has been delivered to 3 journalists and a federal compliance officer in the last 20 minutes. Another pause. While we were driving here, the governor in the 7th row had his phone out. The senator in row 3 was leaning toward his aide. Julian's smoothness was not entirely gone. Men like Julian do not lose their composure entirely. They have trained against it too thoroughly, but it had developed structural damage, the kind that doesn't repair itself. He looked at Hyeon with something that had ceased to be performance and become actual, which was a kind of ugliness that Teena had only seen twice before. "You have no idea," Julian said, and his voice was quiet now too, "what you have just walked into. You have no idea who I have in my corner, or what I can do to you and everyone you've—" "I know exactly who you have," Hyeon said. "I put most of them in those positions." Julian stopped. "The compliance officer," Hyeon said. "The journalist at the Tribune. The federal contact your campaign manager speaks to on the 2nd Tuesday of every month. I have been building a very specific architecture around you, Julian, for the last 2 years, since I understood what you had done and where you were taking her." His voice did not change. It remained what it had been throughout, factual, unhurried, the voice of a man who prepared. "This morning was not an opportunity I created. It was one I was ready for. The guns were still up, but the men holding them were doing something that guns in the hands of hired security do when the man who hired them appears to be losing. They were waiting for a new instruction, and the new instruction wasn't coming. And in the absence of it, they were becoming uncertain, which is the one thing that makes armed men in enclosed spaces very, very dangerous." Hyeon turned from Julian. He turned fully, and the guns at his back did not alter his posture by a single degree, and he walked the remaining 5 feet to the altar and stopped in front of Teena. Up close, after 5 years, he was exactly who she remembered, and entirely more than she had allowed herself to remember him as. The tattoos at his collar, the steadiness of his dark eyes, the particular quality of his attention, which had always made her feel like the most important information in the room. He was looking at her now the way he had looked at her in that apartment, in those mornings, in the specific and quiet way of a man who has never once confused her for anything other than exactly who she was. He reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a key, small, brass, ordinary. "Your gallery," he said, quietly, just to her. "The building on Archer Street, the anonymous foundation that funded the lease." His jaw moved slightly. "That was me. It's always been me. I never—" He stopped, chose different words. "I wasn't going to let him be the only person keeping you safe." She stared at him. 5 years. The gallery that had given her a life of her own. A creative independence she had held onto as proof that she could build something that wasn't about Julian, wasn't contingent on Julian, that had been Hyeon. And somehow, even in all her deliberate not looking, some part of her had always suspected there was a hand she couldn't see keeping the worst of it at bay, quietly, from a distance he'd been asked to maintain, watching over her without her consent or knowledge because he apparently could not stop being exactly who he was, which was a man who loved her without terms. She had left him because she was afraid of his world. His world had been protecting her the entire time she was afraid of it. He held out his tattooed hand. Open. The same gesture he had offered once before, 5 years ago, in a different key, not to hold her in place but to offer her a direction. "You don't have to," he said. "But I'm here." Julian said something. She didn't hear what it was. She heard the shape of it, a threat, a command, a last attempt at the authority he had manufactured over 3 years, and it reached her from a very great distance, like sound traveling across water, the way things sound when they have already become irrelevant. She took Hyeon's hand. His fingers closed around hers. Warm, steady, real in a way that nothing in this room had been real all morning. She did not look back at the altar. She did not look at the flowers or the guests or the officiant or the extraordinary light. She didn't look at Julian, who was saying something to his men that resulted in a shuffle of movement, not an advance, because his men were looking at Hyeon's men along the walls and making the correct calculation, but the desperate lateral movement of a situation collapsing on its own structural failures. Someone in the 3rd row had a phone to their ear. The governor was standing. The senator from row 3 was already at the side exit with his aide, the particular speed of a man removing himself from a scene before the scene becomes the only thing anyone remembers about him. Hyeon walked her back up the aisle. Not fast, not hurried, with the same unhurried certainty with which he had walked down it, because for him, she understood, this was always how it was going to resolve. He had known it before he got out of the car. He had known it before he got in the car. He had known it, possibly, for 2 years while he quietly built the architecture of Julian's unraveling around them both. His hand was around hers, and she felt the ink of his tattoos under her fingertips, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost funny in its simplicity, that she had spent 5 years being afraid of this, and she could no longer locate what exactly the fear had been about. Not the man. She had never been afraid of the man. She had been afraid of what loving him made her unguarded, unhidden, completely without the protective performance of a woman who has everything managed and explained and safe. Hyeon had always seen her too fully for the performance to work. He had always known exactly who she was beneath it, and for a 26-year-old who had constructed safety out of managing other people's perceptions, that had felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. Now she was 31 and she had just spent 3 years inside the alternative, and she understood the difference between a man who sees you and uses what he sees, and a man who sees you and holds what he sees as something worth protecting. They came through the oak doors. The lobby of Hargrove Manor was empty except for 2 of Hyeon's men who fell in behind them without instruction. The coordinator was gone. The estate staff had made the practical decision, collectively, to be elsewhere. Through the tall windows, the afternoon light was still sharp and clean, and the estate grounds were very quiet in a way that spoke to how thoroughly the outer perimeter had been resolved. Outside, on the stone steps, the air hit her. June air, warm and real, carrying the smell of cut grass and the distance that exists beyond manicured grounds. The actual world that had been on the other side of these walls all morning while she sat on a marble floor and tried to find a way out. She stopped at the top of the steps and breathed it. Hyeon stopped with her. He did not rush her. He stood beside her with his hand still around hers and let her take the breath at whatever length it needed to be. After a moment, she turned and looked at him. 2 years, she said. You've been building a case against him for 2 years. Longer, he said. The case took 2 years. Understanding what he'd done to us took longer. She looked at his face. Why didn't you tell me? He was quiet for a beat. Because you needed to choose, he said. Not because you found out I was watching. Because you decided. His eyes stayed on hers. Did you decide? She looked at him, the tattoos, the suit, the steadiness, the 5 years of patience that had apparently expressed itself as a comprehensive 2-year federal evidence file, which was possibly the most Hon Ji way of loving someone that she could imagine, and she laughed. It surprised her. It was real and short and slightly wrecked around the edges, and it was the first completely honest sound she had made all day. Yes, she said. I decided. He looked at her for one more second with that specific attention, the one she had spent 5 years trying to find an adequate substitute for and couldn't. Then something shifted at the corners of his mouth, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a very specific outcome and has now received it. He turned to the steps. The black SUV was at the bottom of the drive. Of course it was. She didn't know when it had gotten there, it simply was. The way Hyeon's arrangements simply were, efficient and inevitable and already in place before you thought to wonder about them. He walked her down the steps. She was still in the $12,000 wedding dress. She was still wearing the coral lipstick Julian had chosen. The pearl drops were still in her ears, and the diamond was still on her left hand, and she would address all of those things in the order they became relevant. But right now, she was walking down stone steps, with her hand in a man's tattooed hand, and the afternoon was wide and open, and the car door was being held by someone who did not work for Julian Mercer. She got in. The door closed. Inside the SUV it was quiet, the way it is inside a thing that is solid and moving, and taking you somewhere the opposite direction from where you have been. The estate disappeared behind the tinted glass, the gates, the hedgerows. The stone facade of the manor, with its extraordinary flowers and its extraordinary light, and its 300 guests who were, at this moment, living through the most significant event of their social calendar in a direction Julian had not anticipated. She pulled the engagement ring from her finger. She held it for a moment, not with sentiment, just looking at it, the weight of it, the thing it had represented, and the thing it had actually been. And then she set it on the console between them, with the small, definitive sound of something put down for the last time. Hyeon looked at it. Then he looked at her. "There's a place in the mountains," he said. 2 hours north. I had it opened this morning." A pause. "I thought you might want somewhere quiet." "You had it open this morning," she repeated. "Before I got your text." She looked at him. "I told you," he said. "I was ready." She turned and looked out the window at the city moving past them. The streets, the ordinary afternoon of it. People who had no idea what had just happened inside a stone manor across the city, living their regular Tuesday in the June light, and she felt something she had not felt in 3 years, possibly longer. Not safe, exactly. Safety as she had previously understood it, managed, curated, performed, was not what this was. This was something else, something older. The feeling of being exactly where the truest part of you has been pointing for a very long time, without the static of fear drowning out the signal. She leaned back against the seat. "Tell me about the mountains," she said. And the SUV moved through the city, and the city fell behind them, and neither of them looked back. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and if Teena and Hyeon can truly outrun everything Julian has left in motion. Because a man who spent 3 years building a cage does not simply walk away from the wreckage. Drop a comment right now, and tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to you, and know exactly how far this story is traveling. Like this, if you are completely obsessed with this ticking clock romance between a bride on the edge and the most dangerous man in the city who moved heaven and earth in 30 minutes flat for the woman he never stopped loving. Turn on notifications because the next chapter is coming, and trust me, you are not ready for what Julian does when a man like him has nothing left to lose. See you in the next one if the syndicate boss and his bride make it to those mountains.